So today we get to talk about the sonnet cycles of the Elizabethan era. This is the real heart of the sonnet tradition in English in the Renaissance era. And I want to talk today and give some examples from three of the most important sonnet cycles. Now, this is an era of sonnet cycles. There were many more sonnet cycles than the ones I'm going to talk about. But the three that are most important to know and that are best to start with are the Amoretti sequence of Edmund Spenser, the Astrophel and Stella sequence of Sir Philip Sidney, and then, of course, the sonnets of Shakespeare. So we've already talked about how Thomas Wyatt brought the Petrarchan sonnet cycle tradition to England in the mid-1500s. By the 1580s, it was seen as, almost the duty of a poet to show his prowess by writing sonnets. And you have these three men whose names all happen to begin with S, Sidney, Spenser, and Shakespeare, who try their hand at and arguably master the New English sonnet tradition. So let's start by talking about Astrophel and Stella by Sir Philip Sidney. Now, Sir Philip Sidney was this kind of quintessential Renaissance poet. When we think about a Renaissance poet, we think, maybe he's wearing a big hat with a feather in it. He probably has a lady love that, he writes romantic sonnets to. Maybe he's a little swashbuckling, not above getting in a duel or two. This all was true of Sir Philip Sidney. Philip Sidney not only got in a duel or two, he actually died in battle fighting for Queen Elizabeth. He also wrote lots of beautiful sonnets. The Astrophel and Stella sequence is 108 sonnets plus 11 songs, so longer poems that aren't in the sonnet form. And he wrote these in the 1580s. Now, Sir Philip Sidney was a little older than Spenser and Shakespeare. And so Sidney saw a Elizabethan poetic scene that was devoid, especially of Shakespeare. Sidney has this essay called A Defense of Poesy or An Apology for Poetry. Both titles are used, in which he says, we've got some great lyric poetry in England, but we don't really have any plays. Drama is not really something that England does well. Now, within 10 years, Shakespeare would, be establishing English drama as the preeminent dramatic tradition of the Renaissance era and, arguably of the last 1,000 years of literature across the world. So Sidney didn't live to see the age of Shakespeare, and yet Sidney made a mark upon poetry by writing the Astrophel and Stella sequence and Defense of Poesy. He also, with his sister, did some metrical translations of the Hebrew Psalms, which are worth taking a look at if you're interested in such things. So I want to get a feel for these Astrophel and Stella sonnets. Well, first of all, why are they called Astrophel and Stella? Well, Sidney makes up these two characters, Astrophel, the male lover, and Stella, the female beloved, and writes poems about these characters, usually in the voice of Astrophel himself. So let's check out a sonnet from Astrophel and Stella. Who will in fairest book of nature know how virtue may best lodged in beauty be? Let him but learn of love to read in thee, Stella, those fair lines which true goodness show. There shall he find all vices overthrow, not by rude force, but sweetest sovereignty. Of reason, from whose light those night birds fly, that inward sun in thine eyes shineth so. And not content to be perfection's heir, thyself dost strive all minds that way to move, who mark in thee what is in thee most fair. So while thy beauty draws the heart to love, as fast thy virtue bends that love to good. But desire still cries, give me some food. I like this poem a lot, partly because it shows a little bit of the tension of the Elizabethan poet. Now, Sir Philip Sidney was a good Christian. He was a good subject of the great Christian Queen Elizabeth. And so he's writing largely in praise of virtue. And he's talking about how it's Stella, it's the beauty of Stella, that can actually lead the lover to virtue. And yet at the end, we have this acknowledgement that desire is this sort of underlying force which is warring against virtue, or maybe tempting virtue not to follow through. So we have this interesting couplet at the end, which is a little different than we get in the Petrarchan sonnet. We don't get an ending couplet. In the Shakespearean, or it wouldn't be Shakespearean to Sidney, but in the English sonnet here, we have this good food rhyming couplet. As fast thy virtue bends that love to good, but desire still cries, give me some food. So one of the things that Sidney does quite well is he shows this possibility of the love for another person, romantic or sexual love, actually being a ethically improving force. But also there's a danger. We can't just assume, if I love a woman, everything I do or everything I desire will be good because my love is pure. Desire is there wanting food, and that food and good dichotomy is something that this rhyming couplet is making us think about. It's always fun when rhyme is used to juxtapose two words that have sort of an intellectual contrast to them. And that's what's going on in Sidney's sonnet here. Let's talk a little bit about Sidney's successor. So Sidney's sonnets were written in the 1580s, published in the early 1590s. And around this time, there's another rising poet, Sir Edmund Spenser. Edmund Spenser is most known for his long narrative poem, The Faerie Queen, but he also wrote a sequence called Amoretti. Now, the Amoretti cycle was written in the 1590s. It's first published in 1595. And there are a few fewer sonnets in Amoretti. There's only 89 sonnets, though. Only 89. It's quite a feat to write 89 sonnets, let alone 8. The 89 Amoretti sonnets are spoken in the voice of the male lover to the female beloved. Surprise, surprise, just like Sidney before him, just like Petrarch even before then. But they are spoken from Spenser's perspective to his wife, or his future wife, in some of the poems. So let's look at Spenser. Spenser is sometimes seen as a little more chaste than Sidney in his sonnets, and yet there's real passion and real romance in them. Let's look at this one. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey. Vain man, said she, that dost in vain essay a mortal thing so to immortalize. For I myself shall like to this decay, and eke my name be wiped out likewise. Not so, quod I, let baser things devise to die in dust. But you shall live by fame. My verse your virtues rare shall eternize, and in the heavens write your glorious name. Where when as death shall all the world subdue, our love shall live, and later life renew. It's an interesting conceit, this kind of conversation with the tide. And we really get a great example of the strong English rhyme scheme here, with strand, away, hand, pay, pray, assay, immortalize, decay, likewise. It's an A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C rhyme scheme. So he's not doing A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, which Shakespeare would often do. He's kind of keeping that B rhyme and linking it into the next 4 lines of that octave. Remember, we've talked about the octave as the first 8 lines of the sonnet. So it's a really tight rhyme scheme here. And it's dramatizing this conversation between the poet, who's writing the name of his beloved on the sand, and the tide, which keeps washing it away. And, there is a little back and forth. He writes it, she takes it away. He writes it, she takes it away. And then the tide, as it can do in poetry, addresses him. It's interesting that the tide is a she. She says, vain man, why are you trying to immortalize a mortal thing? She's going to die. Why are you trying to make her permanent? I'm going to take it away to remind you of mortality. Now, it could end here, and we could just say, oh, yeah, all beautiful things die. That would be, an interesting poetic lesson. But in the sestet, Spenser takes it a little further. He says, let baser things devise to die in dust, but you shall live by fame. About the beloved. You, beloved, shall live by fame. My verse, your virtues rare shall eternize. So it's not that, I'm trying to make eternal the passing things in her, the mortal things. I'm trying to eternize her virtues. In Christian theology, this idea of virtue can remain in the soul even after death. In fact, it does remain, things like faith and hope and love. This is something that Spenser would have known very well from his Geneva New Testament. So he's saying, no, the virtue shall remain. And also, it's a little bit of bragging rights for the poet. I'm going to be the one who help to eternalize them in my verse. And then we have this interesting, it's not just the virtues. We are going to live past death. When as death shall all the world subdue, our love shall live and later life renew. So this love between these virtuous lovers is going to live past death. And there's this kind of taste or foretaste or gesturing toward some sort of paradisical life. This goes beyond, I think, what Sidney's doing with this war between virtue and desire. It's a lot more like something that Dante does or something that Petrarch does in seeing, the death of the beloved as this revelation that, heaven is our goal, and heavenly bliss and proper love within heaven between men and women is the ultimate goal. So how does Shakespeare fit in? Well, Shakespeare was writing sonnets from the mid-1590s onward. So Shakespeare would have been already writing sonnets when Spenser publishes the Amoretti sonnets in the 1595. But Shakespeare didn't collect and officially publish his sonnets until the turn of actually almost 10 years into the new century, 1609. And so in 1609, we have these collected 154 sonnets, which are published. And these go above and beyond what's going on in Sidney and Spenser. Now, Sidney and Spenser have true genius, and you even already see some of the things that Shakespeare is going to talk about in his sonnets in Spenser's sonnet. This, if I can immortalize you in verse. Let's look at Shakespeare's very famous sonnet about immortalizing a beloved in verse. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. It's one thing to meet it in Spenser, this I will immortalize the virtues of my beloved. He does it pretty well. Spenser writes a very capable sonnet, even one of the best sonnets ever written. But then you get to Shakespeare, this is sonnet 18, and you're like, oh, okay, no. Shakespeare, he just gilds this conceit with pure genius. One of the things that stands out to me here is how he doubles his words and sounds so well, and every fair from fair sometime declines. So you both have fair from fair, The fairness is coming off of the fairness or going away from the fair thing. And then some time declines. You have that wonderful assonance, we would call it, this repetition of the I sound from some time and declines. You have it again in by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. You have all these C's in a row. First ch and then cus. And it's brilliant. The sonic structure, the sonic structure of the sonnet is almost unparalleled in any other writer. So what is this saying? Well, I think Shakespeare is actually being a little less theological here than Spenser is. Spenser's saying, look, I'm trying to immortalize her virtues, and plus we're going to be together in heaven after death. For Shakespeare's not thinking about heaven. He's saying, look, everything fades. Everything fades. Rough winds shake the darling buds of May. Gold complexions dim, fair from fair declines. There's no hope of heaven here. It's just, things fall apart. But this poem is going to immortalize you so well that you'll live forever, at least as long as men can breathe and eyes can see. As critics have talked about this, eyes can see, as long as we can read, we'll read this poem. But also that men can breathe. As long as anyone can say this poem aloud, you're going to live. And it's going to give life to you. It's really lovely. The whole of Shakespeare's sonnets, the opening several dozen sonnets are meditating on this. The beloved needs to find a way to keep living. And some of the early sonnets is basically, hey, you're beautiful. You should have children so that you pass on your beauty. But in Sonnet 18, we have this turn to oh, but wait, poetry can preserve your beauty too. Poetry has this stay against death, just like having children is. Shakespeare's sonnets, Sidney's sonnets, Spenser's sonnets stand as this pinnacle of poetry in the Elizabethan era, in the Renaissance era. Know them, study them, read them, enjoy them. Hopefully this has been a good introduction that will send you forth. They're all available for free online. I can put some links below. Go enjoy the world of sonnets.